Chapter 20. Nella's eyes were full of rage as she scanned the swath of destruction around us. The shotgun followed her gaze, looking for its next victim. Daniel was crying and holding the head of his friend in his lap, saying something softly through the tears. I looked at the headless body beside Daniel, the pool of blood inside the charred ring of wood chips, the bodies, the smashed cars. The taste of bile filled my mouth as a wave of nausea swept through me. Quickly, I walked to the edge of the parking lot and faced away from the chaos, frantically trying to keep it together. Nella's voice broke me from my trance. She was screaming, full of fury. "Doc, you miserable, worthless mass! How did you know where we were?" As I raced across the lot to Nella's side, I saw the barrel of the shotgun was pressed against the temple of a downed hunter. To my surprise, the hunter on the ground was a woman. She was middle-aged and wore the same black leather as the rest of the fallen. Her breath was heavy and a trickle of blood ran down the side of her face. "You know better than to expect me to help you in any way." Her voice was rough, like she had a pack of smokes before breakfast. Nella swung the butt of the shotgun down and hit her mouth. Fresh blood poured, and the woman spit out several teeth. And she laughed. "Wallow in an ocean of shit, you pitiable bitch!" Nella brought the gun to her shoulder to fire. The woman's smile slid off her face and she closed her eyes, bracing for the end. Her hand moved up and clutched something hanging around her neck. "Nella, stop!" I shouted. Partly, I felt that I didn't need to see more of other people's blood on me right now, but also, I felt there was something important we were about to lose. I knelt on one knee beside the fallen woman and gently pulled the barrel of the gun, blazing hot, away from the woman's skull. To the woman I asked, "What's around your neck? Let me see." With bright blue eyes, a younger and sadder woman looked back at us. Her grasp opened slowly and showed a locket, old and covered in blood. She didn't fight me, just studied me with her eyes. I dug my fingernail into the crease and it popped open to show a black and white set of pictures, one of a small boy, the other a grown man. The pictures were obviously old, faded. "Your son? Husband?" I asked. She didn't reply. "Are they still alive?" She closed her eyes and a tear rolled down her cheek, carrying blood with it. Nella had backed away, gun held loosely to her side, listening, tired. For a few seconds I considered all the parts of this story. "Nella," I said, finally turning to her, "I think I know what's going on here. Put that gun away. This woman isn't our enemy." With that, I placed my hand over the fallen woman's mouth and closed the open cuts made by the clubbing from Nella. I did the same for the cut on her head. "Why?" she asked, looking up at me. I snapped closed the locket and pressed it back in her hand. "Your boy has your eyes. When you see him again, someday, your story really ought to have a better ending than this." I stood up and saw the 2 teeth lying on the ground. Handing them to her, I said, "Sorry, I don't do dental work." Nella had walked back to Daniel and was stroking his hair. When I got back to them, she looked up at me and said, "You know we can't leave her alive." "You kill her now, and you will never see me again," I said. The look on her face was a mix of total exhaustion and anger. "I didn't sign on with you, Nella, to go around killing people, especially defenseless women. She lives." Nella nodded reluctantly. "We need to go. I can try to carry Shadrach." "That's okay. I got him," Daniel said, getting to his feet. As if the dog was 1/10 the size, the boy lifted him off the ground. He struggled a bit till Nella put her hand on his shoulder, and they walked together back to the minivan, which had escaped mostly unscathed compared to the other 4 cars in the lot. Nella went back to the woman lying on the ground and bent over to say something to her. I couldn't hear them, but the fallen woman pointed directly at me as she spoke. Nella looked at me and nodded. With that, we all got back in the van. "I think we should get to a vet hospital as soon as possible. Shadrach needs attention," I said to Nella, who started the engine. Daniel nodded in agreement. "Unfortunately," Nella said without looking at me, "they will be scouting every animal hospital in the area, waiting for a giant black dog with a bullet wound. We will have Zoo take a look at him." Nella drove back in silence. She didn't even speed. We pulled into the alley and Zoo ran after us, somehow knowing something was wrong. I hopped out immediately and went around to the back to help with the dog. It was then that I noticed all the bullet holes in the car. Zoo and Daniel already had the dog in hand by the time I got around, and I felt more in the way than usual. Nella continued her cold silence as we followed into the house. No one was there except the four of us, so Daniel and Zoo moved to the far side opposite the kitchen, presumably because it was not carpeted. No point practicing the blood cleaning skills if I didn't have to. Nella proceeded to the kitchen and was washing her hands. Looking down, I realized my blood-covered hands could use the same, so I headed to the bathroom. The face in the mirror took me by surprise, spattered with blood and ash, tired. The water ran red in the sink as layer after layer of dried blood and grime fell away. After what must have been 10 minutes, the door cracked open and Nella was standing there. "Stop washing. The rest of the blood is in your mind, and it doesn't come off so easy." She had a glass of amber liquid and extended it to me. "You can make your own ice." She wasn't smiling, but I could hardly blame her after what she had just went through. Nella was indeed a warrior, trapped in the body of an old woman. I dried my hands and took the glass of scotch. It was still before noon, but I was ready for Thursday to be over. The scotch soaked into my tongue like a sponge coming to life. I wanted more. Nella was sitting in the kitchen with the bottle in front of her, so I sat across and refilled both our glasses. "Sláinte!" Nella raised the glass and said nothing. I have never taken a life, or restarted one, for that matter, but I figured it was something not to be taken lightly. "When can we talk about what just happened?" I asked. Nella shrugged. "So talk." Not the obvious warm intention I was hoping for. "I have a lot of questions, obviously. The first being, how often does that happen?" Nella just shook her head and stared at the swirling drink in her hands. "Wrong question." I had no idea where she was going with this, so I tried again. "Well then, why are they so adamant about getting Daniel?" "Wrong question." Again, she did not look up. How did they find us?" "Bingo," Nella said, locking her gaze on me. "How did they find us, Finn? Care to elaborate?" Her voice was rising slightly, and Zoo had come over to investigate. Nella's anger was directed toward me, and I had no idea why. "You probably want to know what happened, don't you, Zoo?" I wouldn't mind a recap myself, I thought. Zoo sensed something was about to get nasty, not because he was clairvoyant. Nella was just that obvious. "Why are you mad at me, Nella? Did I do something wrong in battle? Remember, I barely know how to move pillows around." "How did they find us, Finn? Come on now, think. How could they possibly know where we were?" I was starting to sweat as Nella was now standing. Even Zoo took a step back. "I told you. I don't know," I said. "Clearly I didn't tell anyone because I didn't even know what I would be doing today, or that I would be leaving to walk the dog. Plus, I didn't call anyone the entire time. You were right there." I wasn't sure why I was getting defensive. Probably because I had that feeling I was still missing some key facts. I pulled out my phone and dropped it on the table to show Nella that I hadn't used it. She ignored it. "Oh, I believe you didn't call anyone, but you did give them your number so they could track you." Nella's eyes were like daggers. I don't understand. How could I have given them my number? I didn't know anyone that attacked us." The words came out of my mouth and I already knew they were false. I didn't need the voice in the back of my head to tell me I had royally fucked up. I picked up my phone and turned it on. No service. Nella grabbed the phone out of my hand and went to the history screen, and there it was, top of the list, Tiffany's phone as the last call. She held it out in front of me with vindication and said nothing. My Irish temper was barely holding in check, probably because my Catholic guilt is very persuasive. I needed to sort this out. Tiffany was not capable of setting this up. Was she? Perhaps it was my gut intuition, which lately has proven to be highly unreliable, or maybe I was in denial because she was so damn hot. But I just couldn't believe that was the whole story. "Nella," I said, "if this is my fault, I'm sorry. Obviously, I didn't mean for this to happen. I should probably go." I stood to leave, and Zoo placed his hand heavily on my shoulder, forcing me back into my seat. He glared at Nella. "How dare you? This was your fault, completely and totally. This inexperienced Shazi could not possibly know what he was up against. If you are to lead, then lead. Our defeat
comes only from within us and lives only so long as we give it breath. You are not defeated today by the fallen. You are yourselves defeated so long as you choose to be."
His words hung in the air after he walked away. Nella looked about ready for a nervous breakdown, and I had just one question. What's a Shazi? Nella looked up at me, a tear running down her wrinkled face, and cracked a smile.
"Never mind, you cretino," she said, and came around the table, arms open, and hugged me. "He's right. This was my fault. At this point in your training, you will succeed or fail based on my ability to keep you alive. Eventually, it will be up to you whether you succeed." At that, Nella moved to the dark corner of the large room and out of sight, presumably to nap or maybe cry. I felt terrible, knowing that Tiffany may have been the cause of this, but I was far from certain that she was guilty. The door opened, snapping me out of my trance, and I saw Mac come in carrying a bag of supplies. He immediately raced over to the wall where Daniel was partially buried by a mound of black fur. Zoo was standing there too, arms crossed, saying nothing. I was still curious as to whether I had made things worse or better for the dog, but I was terrified to approach Daniel to find out. At that moment, Mac looked up at me and waved me over. And he closed the wound as fast as he could, but there was a lot of blood everywhere," Daniel was explaining. Mac nodded and was carefully moving Shadrach's leg. The dog was breathing, but was not responding to much else. He pulled back the dog's lips and exposed the chalk-white gums. "He needs fluids. You're right, he lost a lot of blood. First things first," and he pulled out a clear plastic medical bag filled with clear liquid. "Daniel, this saline will help stabilize Shadrach so his body can finish the repairs on his own." He was connecting the tube and attaching the needle to the end. "Tell me, Finn, what were you able to do?" Daniel immediately looked up at me with hope in his eyes. "Well, I have to admit that I didn't really know what I was doing, so I just did what I thought was needed to keep him alive." "We all understand," Zoo broke in, "that you are new to this and did your best. You will not be blamed if this was wrong. We just need to know what happened." "Okay. First, I found the bullet hole and felt around for additional damage. As far as I could tell, the bullet hit the front shoulder and broke the bone. So first, I pulled the bullet out, which caused the blood to start flowing much faster. I continued with the details about fixing the bone and closing the wound, and then looked around for an evaluation of my performance." "What did I miss?" I asked. No one said anything as Daniel also looked back and forth between them, knowing that my error might cost his best friend his life. "Well," Mac finally said, "there may be ligament and soft tissue damage that we don't know about yet, and possibly some bullet fragments you missed." "Nope," I replied. "The bullet was whole. It was smashed a bit, but whole." "Ha!" Zoo blurted out. "I would have left a bullet and a broken bone and just closed a wound. You are a better field surgeon than me." Daniel's boyish grin returned in force, knowing that Zoo's opinion and knowledge carried enormous weight. I did not screw things up after all. Well, except for the whole leading us into a trap thing. Mac had finished with the syringe and was holding the bag up to start the flow of saline. "It should help fairly quickly. His blood pressure is very low from blood loss, so this will help. Of course," he said more to Daniel, "you won't be able to do much with him till he recovers. His body needs to replace all those missing blood cells." Daniel nodded and stroked his furry friend. After a stroke on the dog's side and a ruffle of the kid's hair, I moved back to the general sitting area of the flat and sat in an overstuffed chair. I pulled out my phone and saw that there was still no signal. Tiffany's number, still displayed as the last call. As much as I didn't want to believe that she was capable of doing such a thing, the facts were starting to point in that direction. While the details were heavily circumstantial and full of bias, they still needed to be considered and tested. I was running through my next conversation with Tiffany when a blanket of exhaustion settled on me and I fell into a deep sleep.